Next up, we'll successfully automated job and automatically trigger your continuous delivery system, which cannot be Hi everyone, my name is Rijntjan Ecker and welcome to my course Fast API Fundamentals. I am a long-time developer and educator, and in this course I will teach you about creating REST APIs with Fast API, a very popular and very modern framework that has taken the Python world by storm. Fast API takes advantage of many of the newest Python features like type-ins and async await, and writing REST APIs has never been faster or more fun. REST APIs written in Fast API tend to be very performant as well. In this course we're going to build a REST API with Fast API, and along the way you'll learn about all its major features. We'll cover schemas and automatic data validation and conversion, persistence using SQL model, auto-generated documentation, authentication with OAuth, and much more. By the end of this course, you'll have a firm understanding of all of these, and you'll be ready to create your first REST API with Fast API. Before beginning the course, you should be familiar with Python and the basics of REST APIs. I hope you'll join me on this journey to learn to create your own API with Python with the Fast API Fundamentals course at Pluralsight. Hi, this is Rijntjan Ecker and welcome to this course about the fundamentals of the Fast API framework. In this module I'll give a short introduction of Fast API, what is it and why should you use it, and how does it compare to other frameworks in the Python web development space. Then we'll look at the project. I'll show you a quick overview of what to expect, and we'll go over the things you should already know to be able to watch this course and the requirements you need on your computer to work along. Now, I could have started with a slide all about Fast API, but instead let's just go straight to its homepage to see what it has to say about itself. So here we are, and scrolling down a bit, we read Fast API is a modern, fast, high-performance web framework for building APIs with Python 3.6 or later, based on standard Python type-ins. Among the key features we see that Fast API aims to be fast, quick to write code for, easy and intuitive, standard-based, you write short code with fewer bugs. So that should give you an impression what Fast API aims to be. A modern, cool and fast way to create APIs using the newest Python features. And I have to say, it seems that Fast API has taken the Python world by storm. It's really popular, and for many developers it's now the framework for creating REST APIs, even though it's only been around for a few years. So let's compare Fast API with some other frameworks in the Python web development world. So we have Fast API. It's relatively new, focuses on REST APIs, it heavily uses type-ins to make sure we can create those REST APIs with minimal code, and is very performance focused. It does some really nice things out of the box, like data validation and conversion based on those type-ins, and it generates documentation for all your operations. And let's compare this with Django. Now, Django is a very complete and mature and full-featured project. The many features it provides mostly help you with creating a website, not a REST API. So it is possible to create REST APIs with Django, and even in quite a nice way if you use an extension like the Django REST framework. The thing that FastAPI gives you that Django doesn't, though, is the fact that it uses type hints for automatically doing validation and conversion of your data. In many cases, this makes developing a REST API with FastAPI much faster and much more fun. On the other hand, Django is such a popular and established framework that the tools and ecosystem are just much better developed than with FastAPI, which is the new kid on the block. The other really popular framework is Flask. This is a micro framework, in the sense that it contains almost no functionality and you have to write things for yourself or add them with extensions. Like Django, it was made primarily with websites in mind, not REST APIs. I would say Flask is mostly great for small projects, where you only need a few very specific features and you don't want the all-in-one solution that is Django. By the way, a lot of the way we write operations with FastAPI is heavily inspired on Flask. Using the right extensions with Flask, you can create REST APIs as well, but it will always be a bit more cumbersome than FastAPI. So the conclusion here is that if you want to write just a REST API, FastAPI is a good choice. It has a lot of nice functionality that Flask doesn't provide, like for example the documentation it creates, and all the extras that Django gives you don't really help with creating an API at all. That being said, if you need to create a whole website and the REST API is just a part of that, you might be better off using Django with the Django REST framework. So what are we going to create in this course? Well, it's going to be a REST API for a car sharing app. We'll have several endpoints that you can see here, so we can create, change and delete cars, add trips and more. And as you see here, there's documentation and a testing front end for all operations. All the data will be stored in a database using model classes written using a library called SQL Model. And that looks more or less like this. We'll cover authentication with OAuth, serving HTML pages, and processing HTML form data. FastAPI supports all features of HTTP like cookies, headers, and will use all of those, including a powerful advanced thing called middleware. At the end of the course, we'll see how to unit test and deploy our project. Great. I'm excited to get started, and I hope you are too. So, what do you need to know to follow this course? Well, first of all, you need to know some Python, at least the basics. You should have written some functions, some classes, things like dicts and lists should be familiar to you. We won't be writing any super complex code, but FastAPI does contain some interesting concepts, so you should know your Python to understand it all. A relatively new thing in Python is the addition of type hints, and they are very heavily used in FastAPI. Now I think you can watch this course if you don't know about type hints, but it will help if you know the basics. Again, we won't be doing anything particularly complex, but type hints are everywhere in a FastAPI project. Then there's HTTP. You don't have to be a web developer to watch this course, but you should know the basics of the HTTP protocol. So you should know about a request and a response, methods like get, put, post, status codes, etc. And since FastAPI is a framework to build a REST API, you should be familiar with REST APIs. At the very least, you should have used a REST API once, calling get and post methods to retrieve or change data on a remote system. Finally, you should be familiar with the basics of using a relational database. So you should be aware that we store our data in tables with columns and rows, and you should know about basic SQL statements like select and insert. You don't need to be an expert at all, we won't be writing any SQL in this course, but a basic understanding of how these things work will help a lot. So what do you need to be able to work along on your computer? Well, first of all, you need a recent Python version. I strongly suggest Python 3.10, which is the version I will be using, or anything after that. FastAPI, by the way, does not support any versions older than 3.6. You also need a code editor. I suggest using PyCharm because that's what I will be running, but another very popular choice is Visual Studio Code. But in general, any editor will do, although I do recommend using a full-featured IDE like PyCharm or VS Code. And by the way, the source code for all my demos can be downloaded through Pluralsight or using the GitHub URL shown here. So there's no need to copy everything from the videos by hand, because you can download the source code. And that's our little introduction. Let's start coding in the next module, titled First Steps.
Ahí vamos a la misma.
Hi, my name is Reinier Jan Ecker. In this module we'll take our first steps with FastAPI. So let's start our first FastAPI project and explore the code that it's made up of. We'll run the project, look at it in a browser, and see what FastAPI generates for us. Both the REST operations it serves, as well as the auto-generated documentation. I'll show some common mistakes and how to fix them. Finally, I'll talk a bit more about how exactly FastAPI runs our code, including so-called asynchronous execution. Now let's really get started. We'll start a PyCharm project,